You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Boss Love Story channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. This content is the property of Mafia Boss Love Story. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The rain fell over Castellano Manor like it was morning on command, sheeting down the stained glass windows of the private chapel, blurring the black cars lined up along the gravel drive into smeared shadows. Elena Marchetti stood at the front pew in a dress the colour of midnight, her fingers white around a single lily, and she did not cry. She had cried for 3 days straight after the explosion. She had screamed until her throat gave out, clawed at the police tape around the wreckage of the warehouse on 9th, begged the firefighters to keep looking even after they told her, gently, that no one could have survived that. By the time the priest stood at the altar reciting words over an empty casket, because there had been nothing left of Matteo De Luca to bury, nothing but a signet ring they'd found 3 streets away, warped by heat. Elena had no tears left to give. She had gone hollow, scraped out, a woman standing in the shape of grief with nothing behind her eyes. She felt him before she saw him. She always did. Damiano Castellano entered the chapel the way he entered every room, like the air owed him deference, like the walls themselves knew to make space. He wore black, the way he always wore black, a suit cut so precisely to his frame that it looked less like clothing and more like armour. His face, when she finally turned to look, was carved from something colder than grief. Grief made most men soften. It made Damiano sharper, the hollows beneath his cheekbones deepening, his dark eyes flattening into something unreadable, something that made 3 of his own capos take an involuntary step back when he passed them in the aisle. He did not cry either. Damiano Castellano, she would learn over the following year, did not permit himself the luxury. He stopped beside her at the pew, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, even through the chapel's damp chill, and he looked at the empty casket for a long moment before he spoke. He would have hated this, Damiano said, low, only for her. All this black, all this performance. Matteo hated funerals, said they were for the people who stayed, not the ones who left. "He's not gone," Elena whispered, and hated how small her voice sounded, how it cracked in the middle like something breaking underfoot. "I don't believe it. I won't." Damiano's jaw tightened. For a moment, something moved behind his eyes. Not comfort. He did not know how to offer comfort, had never been taught the shape of it, but a kind of ferocious, controlled grief that mirrored hers so exactly. It frightened her. "I don't believe it either," he said, "but belief doesn't change what the fire took." He did not touch her. He never touched her. Not once during the entire service, not even when her knees buckled slightly during the final blessing and she had to grip the pew to stay upright. Damiano Castellano was infamous throughout the 5 families for many things: his ruthlessness in territory disputes, the way rival bosses went quiet when his name entered a negotiation, the cold arithmetic with which he ended threats before they could fully form. But he was not infamous for warmth. He did not know how to give it. He only knew how to stand guard. And stand guard he did. After the service, as the mourners filtered out into the rain, black umbrellas blooming like funeral flowers across the lawn, Elena caught sight of the men positioned at the edges of the property. Not mourners, sentries. Castellano soldiers in dark coats, watching the tree line, watching the road, watching the Bratva convoy that had the audacity to send a car past the gates in a slow, deliberate crawl. A message, not a condolence. She understood then, with a cold drop in her stomach, that Matteo's death had not just broken her heart, it had left her exposed. Matteo De Luca had been the connective tissue between two houses, the Castellanos and the Marchettis, her father's diminished, weakened family, propped up for a decade by the promise of Matteo's marriage to her, a promise that had kept the wolves at the door from breaking it down. Now the promise was ash, and the wolves knew it. Damiano knew it too. She could see him doing the math, even as he stood in the rain, even as his men murmured updates against his ear. See the ledger of threat assessments scrolling behind his eyes, with the same cold precision he'd apply to a business deal. She was no longer a grieving fiancée to him. She was a liability, a target, an asset without protection. Elena. He said her name like he was testing the weight of it. It was the first time he had ever said it without Matteo's name attached. Not Matteo's Eleanor, not our Eleanor, just Eleanor, solitary, hers alone. You cannot go back to your father's house tonight. Why not? Because the Bratva just drove past this funeral like it was a real estate showing, he said, flat, brutal in the way only truth could be. Because your father's men couldn't guard a lemonade stand. Because in a week, every family from here to Palermo will know that Matteo De Luca is dead, and that the woman he was going to marry is standing in the wind with nothing at her back. Eleanor stared at him. Rain caught in her lashes, slid down her cheeks, indistinguishable now from any tears she might still have had left. So what am I supposed to do? Marry you instead? She meant it as bitterness, as a slap, an insult flung at the absurdity of the moment. Damiano did not flinch. He looked at her the way he looked at contracts before he signed them, assessing every clause, every hidden cost, already 3 moves ahead. Yes, he said, that's exactly what you're going to do. The rain kept falling. Somewhere behind them, a Bratva car idled at the gates like a held breath. The library at the Castellano estate smelled of leather, cigar smoke long since faded into the walls, and the particular hush of old money that had learned to keep its secrets quiet. Elena sat across from Damiano at his father's desk, his desk now. Everything in this house was his now, had been his for 3 years, since the old man's heart finally gave out under the weight of his own sins, and watched him lay out the terms of her life like a man dealing cards. It's a marriage of convenience, he said, nothing more. You'll have my name, my protection, my house. In exchange, the Marchetti-Castellano alliance holds. The wolves stay outside the gate, and your father's territory doesn't get carved up like a Sunday roast the moment the funeral flowers wilt. How romantic, Elena said. Her voice had found its edges again, sharpened by 3 sleepless nights and a fury that had nowhere else to go. You've really thought this through. I think through everything. He did not look up from the paper he was signing. That's why I'm still alive, and half the men who tried to kill my father aren't. And what do I get out of it, besides your house and your name? Now he looked up. His eyes. She had never let herself notice the colour before, not properly. Not when he'd always simply been Matteo's ferocious, unreachable best friend, the shadow at every family gathering, the man who watched the room instead of joining it. were a deep, near black brown, and there was something in them just then that unsettled her more than his coldness ever had. A flicker, a crack in the marble. "You get to live," he said simply. "You get to keep breathing air that isn't full of gunpowder. That's what I'm offering. I'm not offering you a love story, Helena. I buried my best friend 3 days ago. I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. And I won't insult either of us by dressing this up as something it's not." "Then why do it at all? You could protect me without marrying me. Put men on my father's house, extend the alliance under a different clause. Because paper promises die with the men who make them," Damiano said. "Marriage is the only currency these families respect that outlives a body count. You know that as well as I do. You grew up in this world, same as I did." She had. That was the cruelest part of it. She couldn't even retreat into the comfort of naivety, couldn't pretend she didn't understand exactly what kind of arithmetic he was doing, because she'd been raised on the same brutal calculus. Marchetti daughters married for territory the way other families married for love. She had loved Matteo, genuinely, achingly, the kind of love that had crept up on her slowly across a childhood of shared summers and stolen kisses at 17 and a proposal at 22, that had felt, for one blinding moment, like she'd been allowed to keep something soft in a world built entirely of knives. But she had never been foolish enough to think love was the only reason the match had been permitted. "And if I say no?" she asked. Damiano set down his pen. He folded his hands and studied her with the same unnerving stillness he must have used on men across a negotiating table before deciding whether they lived past sundown. "Then I'll protect you anyway," he said. And something about the flat certainty of it landed harder than any threat could have. "Because Matteo would have wanted that, and because I don't leave debts unpaid, and Matteo's memory is a debt I intend to honour until I die. But you'll be protected as a guest under duress instead of a wife with standing. Every capo in this family will treat you as an obligation instead of as mine. And obligations get quietly moved out of the way when they become inconvenient. Wives don't." The word landed strangely in the space between them. Mine. He said it the way he might say my territory or my problem. Proprietary, unemotional, a fact of ownership rather than affection. And yet something in her chest tightened at it anyway. Some old animal part of her that recognized, even through grief, even through the wreckage of everything she'd planned her life around, that being claimed by Damiano Castellano meant something different than being claimed by anyone else. It meant nobody touched what was his. Not rivals. Not fate. Not death itself, apparently, if he could help it, though he hadn't been able to help it for Matteo, and she watched that failure sit behind his eyes like a stone he carried everywhere now. "You hate this as much as I do," she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation. It was, perhaps, the first true tenderness that had passed between them, an acknowledgement that his coldness wasn't cruelty, it was armour stretched over a wound identical to hers. "I don't hate it," Damiano said. "I hate that it's necessary. There's a difference." He pushed the paper across the desk toward her, along with the pen. "I will never touch you unless you ask me to. I will never demand what isn't freely given. But I will put my name and my guns between you and anyone who thinks Matteo's death made you an easy target. That's the whole of what I'm offering. Take it or don't, but decide before the Bratva decides for you. Elena looked down at the contract. Her name and his printed side by side, waiting for ink to make it real. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked with the particular patience of old wealth that had learned to wait out storms. She picked up the pen. "Fine," she said, "but I want it in writing that this ends the moment it stops being necessary." Something crossed his face. Too fast to name, gone before she could be sure she'd seen it. Disappointment, maybe. Or recognition of exactly how temporary he expected to be allowed to matter to her. "Agreed," he said, and took the pen back to add the clause himself, his handwriting sharp and economical, betraying nothing. She signed beneath it anyway. The Castellano penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower overlooking the harbour. All black marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that turned the city into a glittering, distant thing far below. Beautiful and unreachable, the way Damiano seemed to prefer everything in his life to be. Elena arrived with 2 suitcases and the particular numbness of a woman who had signed away the shape of her future in a single afternoon. "Your room is down that hall," Damiano said, gesturing without quite looking at her, as though the geography of his own home was something he'd rather point at than narrate. "Second door. I've had it prepared. If anything's missing, tell Consuela. She manages the house." "You're not going to show me around yourself?" "I have a call with Chicago in 10 minutes. He was already unbuttoning his cuffs, already halfway into the next hour of his day. The wedding. Courthouse quiet, 4 witnesses, no flowers, signed with the same economy as the contract that preceded it, already receding behind him like a task completed rather than a vow exchanged. "This isn't going to be that kind of marriage, Elena. I won't pretend otherwise." "I didn't ask you to pretend anything." He paused at that, halfway to the hall that led to his office, and looked back at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of surprise, a slight stilling, a fraction of a second where the machinery behind his eyes seemed to skip a gear. "No," he said slowly, "you didn't." She found her room exactly where he'd said, tasteful and expensive and entirely impersonal. The kind of space designed by someone who'd been told, "Make it nice," without ever being told for whom. She unpacked in silence. She did not cry, though she wanted to. Some perverse pride kept the tears locked behind her ribs, some refusal to let this apartment, this marriage, this man see her broken on the first night. It was near midnight when she heard him. She hadn't meant to wander the penthouse in the dark, but sleep wouldn't come, and the harbour lights through her window kept pulling her mind back to the warehouse fire, to Matteo's face the last time she'd seen it, laughing, alive, promising to be back from the meeting by dinner. So she'd slipped out barefoot to find water, to find anything that might quiet the loop playing behind her eyes. She found Damiano instead, standing at the window of his study with a glass of something amber in his hand, untouched, the ice long melted. He hadn't turned on the lights. He was simply standing there in the dark, staring out at the black water. And something in the set of his shoulders, a rigidity that looked less like discipline now, and more like a man holding himself together through sheer force of will, stopped her in the doorway. "Can't sleep either," she said. Not a question. He didn't startle. She suspected very little startled Damiano Castellano. He'd likely heard her bare feet on the marble 3 rooms away. "I don't sleep much," he said. "Never have." "Even before?" "Before Matteo, you mean?" He said the name evenly, but she saw his hand tighten fractionally around the glass. "No, even before. This life doesn't leave room for men who sleep soundly." He finally turned to look at her, and in the low light spilling from the city below, his face looked younger somehow, stripped of the armor he wore during daylight hours. "I keep thinking about the last thing I said to him. We argued. Stupid thing. He wanted to handle the meeting alone. I told him to bring men. He laughed at me, said I worried like an old woman. I let him go because I had somewhere else to be." His jaw worked. "If I'd gone with him." "You'd both be dead," Elena said quietly. "Not just him." "Maybe." Damiano looked back out at the water. "Or maybe I'd have seen it coming. I usually do." "You can't carry that." "I can carry whatever I choose to carry." His voice sharpened, defensive, and she understood then that this, grief, guilt, the terrible arithmetic of survival, was the one territory even Damiano Castellano hadn't learned to control. "You don't have to manage my guilt for me, Elena. I didn't ask you to." "No," she said, echoing his own words back at him from hours before. "You didn't." Something almost like a smile ghosted across his mouth. Gone as fast as it came, but real. The first genuine thing she'd seen cross his face since the funeral. "Go to sleep," he said, gentler than she'd expect from a man built like a closed fist. "Tomorrow I have to introduce you to the capos as my wife. They will not be kind about it. I need you rested for that, at least." "Why won't they be kind?" "And because half of them think I married Matteo's woman out of guilt, and the other half think I did it to steal the Marchetti alliance for myself before another family could." His eyes met hers, steady, unflinching. "Neither of them is entirely right, but I'd advise you not to correct them about which half of the truth I'll admit to." She went back to bed that night, turning his words over and over. Neither of them entirely right, and did not sleep. Not because of grief this time, but because some new and unwelcome curiosity had lodged itself beneath her sternum, demanding to know what the third, unspoken reason might be. The dining room table at the Castellano compound seated 20, and by the time Eleanor took her seat at Damiano's right hand the following evening, all 20 chairs were full, capos and consiglieres and their wives, a wall of dark suits and darker eyes, all of them watching her with the particular scrutiny reserved for something newly acquired and not yet trusted. Salvatore Greco, Damiano's underboss, a barrel-chested man with a scar bisecting one eyebrow, was the first to speak once the plates had been cleared. "So," he said, swirling his wine with deliberate casualness, "the boss marries his best friend's fiancée 3 days after the funeral. Efficient." "Careful, Sal," Damiano said, without heat, without even looking up from his glass, but the room went instantly, perfectly still, the way a room does when everyone recognizes a line has been drawn, even if they can't see exactly where. "I mean no disrespect." Salvatore held up both hands, though his eyes stayed on Elena, assessing, cataloguing. "I only wonder what Matteo would say, watching from wherever he is." "Matteo would say exactly what I told her myself," Damiano replied, finally lifting his gaze, and there was something in it now that made even Salvatore's practiced ease falter, a warning delivered without a single raised decibel. That paper promises die with the men who make them, and he'd rather his woman live under my name than end up a bargaining chip for the bratva. If you have a different theory, Sal, I'd love to hear it after dinner. Just the two of us. The threat landed exactly where it was meant to. Salvatore lowered his eyes to his plate and did not raise the subject again. But if the men were merely wary, the women were something else entirely. Isabella Greco, Salvatore's wife, leaned across the table with a smile so sharp it could have drawn blood. "You must tell us, Elena. How does it feel, stepping so seamlessly from one Castellano man to the next? Matteo, then Damiano? Some might call that convenient." Elena felt heat rise up her neck, felt every eye at the table swing toward her, waiting to see whether the grieving widow that wasn't would crumble under the weight of the insinuation. She thought of her mother, who had survived 30 years married into this world, with her spine perfectly straight through every slight, every threat, every dinner exactly like this one. And she found, somewhere beneath the grief, the same steel. "Matteo was never a Castellano," she said evenly. "He was Damiano's best friend, which I imagine made losing him nearly as unbearable for Damiano as it was for me. I'd think a woman married into this family, as long as you have, would understand grief doesn't observe convenient timelines, Isabella. Or has your husband never lost anyone you cared for?" The table went silent in an entirely different way. Isabella's smile thinned to a blade's edge, but she said nothing further, and Elena caught, just at the periphery of her vision, Damiano's hand pausing where it rested on the table, a stillness that felt, unmistakably, like approval. Later, after the capos had filtered out into the night and the house had settled into its late, watchful quiet, Damiano found her on the terrace where she'd gone to breathe air that didn't taste like performance. "You handled that well," he said. "I've had practice. My mother used to say dinner tables in this family are just battlefields with better lighting." Your mother was right. He came to stand beside her at the railing, close enough that she caught the low, clean scent of him beneath the cigar smoke that clung to every man in that house. Something like cedar, something like winter. "Salvatore will test you again. So will Isabella. It's how this family decides whether someone's worth protecting." "And have I passed?" "Tonight." His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but close enough that her pulse did something unexpected and unwelcome in response. "Ask me again in a year." "That's not very reassuring." "I don't deal in reassurance," Damiano said. "I deal in fact. And the fact is, you stood at that table tonight like a woman who understands exactly what she married into. That will keep you safer than any promise I could make you." She studied his profile in the dark, the sharp line of his jaw, the way even at rest his body seemed coiled, ready, incapable of the kind of ease other men allowed themselves. "Do you ever stop calculating?" she asked, "even for a minute?" Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe, or the ghost of something older and more tired than surprise. "No," he admitted, quiet, almost private, the kind of honesty she suspected he rarely permitted himself. "I stopped once. Look what it cost me." He didn't say Matteo's name. He didn't have to. She understood, watching him stare out at the dark water beyond the terrace, that some part of Damiano Castellano had died in that warehouse fire, along with his best friend. The part that had once, however briefly, allowed himself to believe the world could be anything other than a ledger of debts and threats. She wanted, absurdly, to reach for his hand. She didn't. But the wanting frightened her more than anything the Capos had said at dinner. 3 weeks into the marriage, Elena had learned the shape of Damiano's days, the way one learns the tide, not by watching directly, but by feeling the pull of it from another room. He rose before dawn and ran the perimeter of the property himself, a habit none of his men understood, but none dared question. He took breakfast alone, standing, reading reports on his tablet, with the particular intensity of a man who trusted no one else's summary of a threat. He left by 7 and rarely returned before 9 at night, and when he did return, he smelled of gun oil and cold air, and something that might have been exhaustion, if Damiano Castellano allowed himself something so human as exhaustion. She had also learned his rules, delivered not as a list, but as a series of small, exacting corrections over those first weeks. "You don't go anywhere without Marco," he told her the first time she'd tried to walk to the corner market alone, appearing at her elbow within 90 seconds of her stepping onto the street, as though some invisible thread connected her movements to his attention, no matter where in the city he was. "Not the market, not the salon, not your father's house. I don't care if it's daylight. I don't care if it's 4 blocks. I'm not a prisoner, Damiano." "No," he agreed, falling into step beside her with the easy, dangerous grace of a man built for exactly this kind of vigilance. "You're a target with my name attached to it, which is a different thing entirely, and a more urgent one. Humour me." "You could just say you're worried." Something flickered across his jaw. "I could," he said, and did not elaborate further, though the silence that followed felt loaded with something he had no intention of naming aloud. She learned, too, that he never entered her room uninvited, not once, not even the night she left her door unlocked out of habit, and woke to find he'd simply left a blanket folded outside it, because Consuela had mentioned the heating in that wing ran cold. She learned that he ate dinner with her most nights, not because any rule required it, but because, she suspected, though she never asked, the silence of eating alone in that vast penthouse had become, for both of them, harder to bear than the silence of eating together. And she learned that beneath the ice there ran something molten that he kept banked so carefully she almost missed it. Until the night Marco reported a car had idled twice outside the compound gates, license plates registered to a shell company known to launder money for the Bratva's New York arm. She found Damiano in his study at 11 that night, already on the phone, his voice low and controlled in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "I want eyes on that car within the hour," he said. "And I want to know who's inside it before sunrise, or I want to know why my men couldn't find out. Those are the only 2 acceptable answers." He hung up and saw her in the doorway. For a moment something raw passed over his face before he could smooth it away, and she recognized it with a jolt as fear. Not fear for himself. She'd never once seen Damiano flinch at a threat to his own life, had heard him discuss assassination attempts against him with the mild irritation of a man discussing a delayed flight. This was different. This fear had her name written across it. "They're watching the house," she said. "They're watching you," he corrected, low and sharp, moving toward her with a kind of controlled urgency that made her chest tighten. "Watching to see if the marriage is real. If it's not, if they think you're unprotected in anything but name, they'll test it, and I will not let that happen." He stopped in front of her, close enough now that she had to tilt her chin to hold his gaze, close enough that she could see the fine tension threaded through every line of his face. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" "You're telling me you're scared," she said quietly. His jaw ticked. "I'm telling you," he said, each word deliberate, "that if anything happened to you, I don't know what I would become. And I have spent my entire life making sure no one ever has to find out what I become when I lose control of myself. So no, you will not walk anywhere alone. You will not open a door you don't recognize. You will not test the perimeter of what I can protect, because I am not interested in learning my own limits where you're concerned." The words hung between them, too raw, too unlike the careful, businesslike man who'd laid a contract across a desk 3 weeks earlier. Elena's pulse hammered somewhere in her throat. She thought of Matteo. She always thought of Matteo, guilt arriving like clockwork whenever some new feeling stirred for the man who'd married her in his place. And yet, standing in the low light of that study, with Damiano's dark eyes fixed on her like she was something worth burning the world down to keep safe, she felt, for the first time since the funeral, entirely, fiercely alive. "Okay," she whispered. Something in his shoulders eased, fractionally, like a held breath finally released. "Okay," he echoed, and for a moment, just a moment, his hand lifted as though to touch her face, before he caught himself, curled his fingers back into a fist, and stepped away, putting the careful, necessary distance of a contract between them once more. The attack came on a Tuesday, the most mundane day of the week, which was perhaps why it worked as well as it nearly did. Elena had gone, against her better judgment, and with Marco 3 steps behind her the entire time, to visit her father's house across town, a duty visit, the kind Damiano couldn't object to without seeming needlessly cruel, though she'd caught the flicker of unease in his eyes at breakfast when she'd mentioned it. Her father, Antonio Marchetti, had aged a decade in the month since Matteo's death. His once proud shoulders stooped under the weight of a debt he could no longer pay in strength, only in his daughter's marriage. "Damiano treats you well?" he asked, over espresso in the sitting room where she'd grown up, the furniture the same worn velvet it had always been, the family fortune too depleted these last years to replace it. "He treats me carefully," Eleanor said, which was truer than well, and less complicated to explain. "Like something that might break if he's not paying attention." Her father studied her over the rim of his cup. "That's not nothing, from a man like Damiano Castellano. His father would have married you off and never looked at you again, except to collect on the arrangement." "Damiano isn't his father." "No," Antonio agreed, something wistful in his voice. "He isn't. Matteo used to say that, you know, that Damiano spent his whole life trying to be the opposite of the man who raised him. Maybe that's why he loved Damiano the way he did, like a brother, not just a friend. Maybe that's why." He stopped himself, throat working, unable to finish the thought. They were still sitting there, in the particular hush of shared, unspoken grief, when Marco's voice cracked through the intercom from the front gate, tight with an urgency that raised every hair on Elena's arms before he'd even finished the sentence. "Signora, we have to move, now." The first gunshot came before he'd finished the word. What followed happened in the fractured, adrenaline-slow way violence always seems to, later in memory. Marco's arm hauling her down behind the heavy oak sideboard, her father shouting something she couldn't pass over the ringing in her ears, the front windows of the sitting room exploding inward in a hail of glass as automatic fire raked across the facade of the house. She heard herself screaming her father's name. She heard Marco radioing for backup with a calm that seemed impossible given the chaos, his body angled over hers the entire time like a shield he'd been born wearing. And then, cutting through the gunfire like something out of a nightmare made flesh, she heard Damiano's voice. She would never fully understand later how he'd arrived so fast. Marco's initial call had gone out less than 4 minutes before Damiano's car came screaming up the drive, before he was out of it and moving across open ground toward the house with his gun already drawn and his face carved into something she had never seen on him before. Not the cold precision of the boardroom, not the banked grief of the study at midnight, but pure, unrestrained fury, the kind that made his own men flinch back from his path as he crossed the lawn toward the gunfire, like it was nothing more than weather he intended to walk straight through. "Get down!" someone shouted, and Damiano did not get down. Damiano returned fire with a precision that felt almost surgical even in the chaos, moving toward the house in a straight, relentless line. And Elena, pressed against the floor beside her terrified father, glass in her hair, Marco's weight still covering her, understood in that moment, with a clarity that cut through even her own fear, that she was watching a man who had decided, somewhere between the phone call and the driveway, that his own life was worth spending entirely, if it meant reaching her in time. The gunfire stopped, almost as abruptly as it began. Damiano's men, arriving in force behind him, had turned the tide within minutes, the attackers scattering or falling, 2 of them captured alive and dragged toward waiting cars for questioning that would not be gentle. And then Damiano was there, in the wreckage of her father's sitting room, hauling her up from behind the sideboard with hands that shook, actually shook. She felt it, felt the tremor in his grip even as he ran his hands over her arms, her face, checking for blood that wasn't there with an urgency that bordered on desperate. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice came out thin, unconvincing even to her own ears. "Damiano, I'm fine." "You are not fine," he said, and his voice cracked, actually cracked, the first crack she had ever heard in it, a fissure running straight through the marble facade he'd maintained since the day of the funeral. "You could have died. 4 minutes, Elena. 4 minutes and I would have been too late, and I—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. He pulled her against his chest instead, one hand cradling the back of her head, his heart hammering so hard beneath her cheek she could feel it as clearly as her own pulse. And for the first time since she'd signed that contract in his study, Damiano Castellano held her like a man who had stopped calculating entirely and simply, helplessly, needed to know she was still breathing. They did not speak of the embrace afterward. That was, Elena would come to understand, simply how Damiano processed anything too large to name. He folded it away, filed it beneath layers of action and consequence, and moved forward as though the moment had never cracked him open at all. But something had shifted between them in the wreckage of her father's sitting room, some invisible boundary redrawn, and neither of them could quite pretend otherwise, even as they tried. The two attackers captured alive gave up their answer within a day, in a basement room beneath the Castellano compound that Elena was not permitted to see and did not ask to. Bratva, as suspected, a probing attack, not a full assault, meant to test whether the marriage's protection was real or merely paper, meant to gauge how hard Damiano would fight for something he'd only claimed a month prior. "They have their answer now," Damiano told her that night, standing in the doorway of her room, a threshold he still, out of some rigid, self-imposed discipline, refused to cross without invitation, even after everything. There were shadows beneath his eyes that hadn't been there before the attack, and something new in the way he looked at her, something that had stopped bothering to hide itself. "They know what happens now if anyone comes near you." "And what's that?" "I burn it down," he said simply. "Whatever it is, whoever's behind it. I don't negotiate for you, Elena. I don't compromise. That was true before today. It's absolute now." "You almost died today." "I would have," he agreed, without a trace of drama, as though discussing the weather. "Willingly. That's not new information, if you've been paying attention." She had been paying attention. That was precisely the problem. She had watched him over the past month in 100 small, unguarded moments. The way his shoulders dropped a fraction when he found her safely at the dinner table each night. The way he'd started leaving his study door open on the nights he worked late, as though some part of him wanted her to know he was still awake if she needed anything. The careful, deliberate space he maintained between them that had nothing to do with indifference and everything to do with a self-control so total it had become its own kind of confession. "Why didn't you touch me before today?" she asked. "Not once, in a month. You said you wouldn't demand anything I didn't freely give, but you've barely let yourself be in the same room as me for more than an hour." Something moved behind his eyes. Old grief, she thought at first, and then recognized it as something closer to shame. "Because Matteo asked me to look after you the week before he died," Damiano said, quiet, the words dragged up from somewhere he clearly hadn't intended to excavate tonight. "We were at the range. He said, if anything ever happens to me, promise me you'll make sure she's safe. Promise me you won't let this family use her." And I promised. His jaw tightened. "I didn't promise to fall in love with her. That wasn't part of the deal, and it feels like the worst kind of betrayal every single time I catch myself doing it anyway." The words landed in the small space between them, like a confession finally torn loose from its moorings. Elena's breath caught. "Damiano." "Don't," he said, though not unkindly, more like a man bracing for a blow he'd decided he deserved. "You don't have to say anything. I know what I am. I'm the man who buried his best friend and married the woman his best friend loved. And some nights I lie awake wondering if some part of me is glad it happened, glad I finally have an excuse to have what I've wanted since we were 19 years old, and Matteo brought you to that summer house and introduced you as his girl. And I hated him for exactly 4 seconds before I loved him too much to hate him for anything at all." Elena stood very still, her heart slamming against her ribs. "You've wanted me since we were 19. Damiano's eyes closed briefly, as though he'd only just realized how much he'd given away. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It never mattered. You were his. You're grieving him. And I am the last man on earth who has any right to want anything from you, given everything I've just told you." "That's not your decision to make for me," Elena said, low, unsteady, some new and reckless courage rising in her chest, even as grief and guilt warred against it in equal measure. I loved Matteo. I still love Matteo. That doesn't just stop because he's gone. But you don't get to decide what I'm allowed to feel about anything else, Damiano. Not even to protect me from yourself. He looked at her for a long moment. Something fierce and wounded and terribly hopeful moving behind his eyes before he stepped back from the doorway, retreating the way he always retreated when a feeling grew too large for the room to hold. Go to sleep, Elena, he said, voice rough. Please, before I say something else I can't take back. He left before she could answer. She lay awake long after, listening to his footsteps pace the length of the hallway outside her door for nearly an hour before finally, reluctantly, going quiet. 6 weeks into the marriage, Damiano took her to Onyx for the first time, the nightclub the Castellano family owned outright, 3 floors of glass and black lacquer sunk into the heart of the financial district, the kind of place where half the city's power brokers came to be seen doing business that would never appear on paper. It was, Damiano explained on the drive over, less a social outing than a necessary appearance. The Moretti family is hosting a private event on the 3rd floor tonight, he said, adjusting his cufflinks with the particular precision of a man preparing for battle rather than a party. They've requested we attend. It would be an insult to decline, and after the attack, I want every family in this city to see exactly how unafraid I am to walk you through a room full of people who might wish us harm. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be a message. He glanced at her, and something in his expression softened just slightly at whatever he saw on her face. You'll be safe. I promise you that much. Onyx at night was a different animal than she'd imagined. Not merely luxurious, but almost operatic, bass thrumming up through the soles of her heels, dark velvet booths occupied by men whose smiles never reached their eyes, the air thick with expensive perfume, and the particular electricity of a room full of people, all quietly calculating each other's worth. Damiano's hand found the small of her back the moment they crossed the threshold, the first deliberate touch he'd initiated since the wedding, and something about the possessive weight of it, the unmistakable claim in the gesture, sent a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with fear. Stay close, he murmured against her ear, low enough that only she could hear it over the music. Tonight, you don't leave my side. She didn't intend to. But an hour into the evening, cornered by an aging Moretti cousin whose interest in her clearly extended well past polite conversation, Elena found herself grateful for the promise regardless. Damiano Castellano's wife, the man said, close enough that she could smell the whiskey on his breath, his hand settling on her arm with a familiarity she hadn't invited. Everyone's talking about you, you know. The girl who went from one Castellano man's bed to the next inside a month. Must be something special about you. Remove your hand, Elena said, low and cold, or I'll remove it for you. The man laughed, delighted rather than deterred, tightening his grip, and then, abruptly, went white, as a shadow fell across the table. Damiano did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stepped into the man's space with a stillness so absolute it silenced the surrounding booths, and when he spoke, his voice carried the particular quiet of a man who had killed before and would not hesitate to again. "You have 3 seconds to take your hand off my wife," he said, "before I take it off you permanently. I am only going to say this once, so I'd advise you to use those 3 seconds wisely." The man released her arm as though burned. Damiano did not so much as glance at him again, dismissed him entirely, the way one dismisses something already dealt with, and instead turned to Elena, his hand finding her waist with a gentleness so at odds with the violence he'd just threatened that it made her head spin. "Come dance with me," he said, quiet, almost a request rather than a command, and led her onto the floor before she could answer. The music slowed into something low and aching, and Damiano pulled her close, closer than propriety strictly demanded, closer than a marriage of convenience should have permitted. One hand splayed against the small of her back, the other laced through her fingers, his cheek resting near her temple as they moved. "You didn't have to do that," Elena murmured. "Threaten him like that." "Yes, I did." His voice was rough, low, stripped of its usual careful control. "Elena, I have spent 6 weeks trying to hold myself at a distance you didn't ask for, in a marriage that was only ever supposed to be paper and protection. But watching that man put his hands on you—" He stopped, breathed out unsteadily against her hair. "I don't think I have it in me to keep pretending I only feel obligation toward you. I don't think I ever did." Her heart hammered against her ribs, the club's dark, glittering chaos fading into background noise around them. "Damiano, I'm not asking you to say it back," he said quickly, quiet, almost desperate in its restraint. "I know what I promised Matteo. I know what you're still grieving. I just needed you to know the truth of it, finally, instead of carrying it alone every night like some kind of penance." His hand tightened fractionally around hers. "I am completely, hopelessly obsessed with you, Elena Marchetti. I have been for longer than either of us should ever say aloud. And I don't know what to do with that, except keep you safe and hope someday it doesn't feel like a betrayal to want you too." She pressed her forehead against his shoulder, breathing him in, cedar, winter, the low thrum of danger that clung to him always, and said nothing, because she had no answer yet that wouldn't feel like a betrayal of someone else's memory. But she did not pull away, and when his arms tightened around her on that crowded dance floor, surrounded by a room full of people who might have wished them dead, Eleanor let herself, for one reckless, aching moment, simply be held. The months that followed the nightclub settled into something neither of them named aloud, but both of them understood had changed. Damiano no longer maintained the careful, exacting distance of the marriage's first weeks. He touched her more now. Small things, a hand at her back, guiding her through a doorway, fingers brushing hers when he passed her coffee in the mornings. The accumulated evidence of a man slowly, deliberately allowing himself to want something he'd spent a decade denying himself. And Elena, for her part, found herself watching for those small touches the way one watches for weather, with an anticipation she didn't fully trust herself to examine too closely. "You're smiling," Consuelo observed one morning, setting a plate of pastries on the kitchen island with the knowing look of a woman who had run this household long enough to see everything and comment on nothing until now. "First time in months I've seen it reach your eyes, Signora." Was it that obvious? "Only to anyone who's been watching you grieve for the last year," Consuela said gently. "There's no shame in it, you know. Grief doesn't mean you're not allowed to be alive at the same time. Matteo would have wanted you happy. He wasn't a selfish man, whatever else this family made of him. Elena turned the pastry over in her hands, not eating it, thinking of Matteo's laugh, the particular warmth of him that had first drawn her in at 17, so different from Damiano's banked, careful fire, and yet she was beginning to understand, not entirely unrelated to it either. Both men had loved fiercely. Matteo simply hadn't been taught to hide it the way Damiano had. "Do you think he'd forgive me?" she asked quietly. "For feeling anything at all, this soon?" "I think," Consuela said, "that the dead don't keep ledgers the way the living do. Only the living do that. And I think you've been keeping one against yourself for a year now that no one asked you to keep." That evening, Damiano found her on the terrace again, the place that had become over these months something like neutral ground between them, the one space in the penthouse where the careful architecture of their marriage seemed to loosen just slightly, where conversation came easier than anywhere else in that glass and marble fortress. "You seem lighter today," he observed, coming to stand beside her at the railing, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, a proximity that would have been unthinkable 4 months ago and felt, tonight, entirely natural. "Consuela gave me a talking to." "About?" "Grief, guilt, whether I'm allowed to feel anything else alongside them." She glanced at him sideways, found him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse stutter. "Do you ever feel guilty for wanting this?" Damiano was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the harbour lights, the muscle in his jaw working with the particular tension of a man choosing his words with unusual care. "Every day," he admitted finally. "I loved Matteo like a brother. I would have taken a bullet for him without hesitation, and did once, years ago, when we were younger and stupider, and thought our loyalty to each other was bulletproof too." A ghost of old pain crossed his face. "So yes, every time I catch myself wanting you, which is constantly, if I'm honest, more than I've ever wanted anything, some part of me hears his voice asking how I could do this to him. But then I remember he asked me to protect you. And somewhere in the last few months, protecting you stopped feeling like a promise I was keeping for his sake and started feeling like something I would have chosen for my own sake regardless. That's not a small thing to admit." "No," he agreed, "it isn't." He turned to face her fully now, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating off him in the cool night air. "I'm not going to push you, Elena. I meant what I said the day we signed that contract. I will never demand what isn't freely given. But I needed you to know that whatever's growing between us isn't obligation anymore, on my side. Hasn't been for a long time, if I'm being honest with myself. I think some part of me has wanted you since before I had any right to." She reached up, slowly, and pressed her palm flat against his chest, feeling the accelerated thud of his heart beneath her hand, proof, undeniable and warm, that the ice she'd once thought impenetrable had a pulse after all, had perhaps always had one, simply buried deep enough that only grief and danger and unbearable proximity had finally coaxed it to the surface. "I'm not ready," she said softly, "to call this anything yet. But I don't want you to stop either. Is that fair?" Damiano's hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his heart, and something in his eyes, relief, hope, a fragile kind of joy he clearly hadn't let himself expect, made her breath catch. "That's more than fair," he murmured. That's more than I thought I'd ever be allowed to have. Neither of them moved for a long moment, the city glittering below them, the weight of everything unsaid settling into something that finally, quietly, felt like the beginning of an answer instead of a question. It happened on an ordinary Thursday, which seemed, in retrospect, exactly the sort of unremarkable day life chose for its most unrepeatable moments. Elena had spent the afternoon in the penthouse's small library, smaller than the one at the compound, but stocked with the same worn leather and quiet. The one room in Damiano's glass tower that felt lived in rather than displayed. Reading through a box of old photographs Consuela had unearthed from storage. Matteo featured in half of them. Matteo and Damiano as teenagers, gap-toothed and reckless, arms slung around each other's shoulders at some family gathering. Matteo and Elena at 19, her head thrown back laughing at something outside the frame. The three of them together once, at a lake house the summer before everything had gotten complicated, before the weight of the family's expectations had settled fully onto their shoulders. She was still holding that last photograph when Damiano found her. Home earlier than usual, his tie already loosened, his jacket discarded somewhere between the front door and the library. "You found the old photos," he said, something wistful crossing his face as he came to sit beside her, close enough that their knees brushed. "Consuela thought I should have them. I didn't know you had this one." She held up the lake house photograph. "You look so young." "We were young." He studied the image with an expression she couldn't quite pass. Grief, certainly, but something gentler running beneath it now, softened by months of shared silence and slow, careful trust. "That was the summer before Matteo brought you to meet everyone properly. I remember thinking—" He stopped himself. "What?" He was quiet for a moment, thumb tracing the edge of the photograph without quite touching it. "I remember thinking he didn't deserve you," Damiano said finally, low, almost ashamed of the admission even now. "Which was an ugly thing to think about my best friend, and I buried it as fast as it surfaced, because Matteo was a good man, and he loved you completely, and I had no right to want anything different for either of you. But I thought it anyway. That summer, and every summer after." Elena set the photograph down slowly on the low table between them, her heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the way Damiano was looking at her now. Unguarded, entirely undefended, none of the careful architecture he wore like armour every other hour of the day. "I used to catch you watching me," she admitted quietly, "at family dinners. I never said anything because I thought I was imagining it, or because saying it out loud felt like a betrayal I didn't have the right to name. But I saw you, Damiano, every single time." His breath caught, audible in the quiet library. "Elena, I loved Matteo," she said before he could retreat, before the old guilt could pull him back behind the walls he'd spent his whole life building. "I will always love Matteo. But I think some part of me has been catching you watching me for so long that I stopped being able to imagine my life without both of you in it, in whatever shape that was allowed to take. And now there's only you. And I don't know how to feel about how much that terrifies me, except that it doesn't terrify me the way it should." Damiano reached up, slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and brushed his knuckles along her jaw, with a tenderness that undid her more completely than any of his careful restraint ever had. "Tell me to stop," he said, voice rough, barely above a whisper, "and I will, right now. I'll never bring this up again, if that's what you need." "Don't stop," Eleanor breathed. He kissed her like a man who had spent a year, longer if she was honest, if she counted every unspoken summer before the fire had ever taken Matteo from either of them, holding himself back from something he wanted more than his own survival. It was not gentle, not entirely. There was too much banked hunger in it for gentleness, too many months of careful distance finally collapsing at once. His hand slid into her hair, tilting her face up to his, and she felt the low sound he made against her mouth as much as heard it, something between relief and disbelief, as though he still couldn't quite trust that this was real and not another calculation gone wrong. When he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, both of them breathing unsteadily, he looked at her with an expression so raw, so entirely unlike the cold, controlled boss the rest of the world knew, that she felt something inside her chest crack open completely. "I have wanted to do that since I was 19 years old," he admitted, voice hoarse. "I have hated myself for wanting it every single day since. And I don't think I have it in me to be sorry for it any more. God help me." "Then don't be," Elena whispered, and kissed him again, this time reaching for him first, this time choosing it with her whole chest instead of simply allowing it to happen. And if some quiet corner of her mind still ached with Matteo's memory, some equally quiet corner had begun, finally, gently, to make room for this new, terrifying, undeniable thing growing between her and the man who had promised to keep her safe and had somehow, along the way, become the person she felt safest choosing. The year that followed unspooled the way grief eventually does, not vanishing, never vanishing, but softening at its edges, learning to coexist alongside something that had begun, cautiously, to resemble happiness. Elena and Damiano did not rush to name what had grown between them. There was no grand announcement to the capos, no repeated wedding to erase the memory of the courthouse ceremony that had bound them out of necessity rather than choice. Instead, there was simply a slow accumulation of small truths, Damiano's hand finding hers beneath the dinner table during family gatherings, the easy way Elena had begun correcting his schedule to include actual rest, actual meals, actual moments of stillness he would never have permitted himself a year earlier. The capos noticed, of course. Salvatore Greco stopped needling her within weeks of noticing how swiftly and completely Damiano's temper sharpened whenever anyone dared imply the marriage was still merely convenient. Isabella Greco, to Elena's genuine surprise, became something almost like a friend, once the performance of the dinner table gave way to grudging respect. "You've changed him," Isabella observed one afternoon, watching from across the garden as Damiano knelt to examine a rosebush Elena had insisted on planting, his sleeves rolled up, dirt on his hands, in a way that would have been unthinkable a year prior. "I've known that man 15 years. I didn't think there was a version of him that gardened." "There wasn't," Elena said, watching him too, something warm blooming in her chest at the sight. "I don't think even he knew there was." The territory disputes quieted too over that year, the Bratva's probing attack having received its answer in blood and consequence, the wider families settling into an uneasy respect for a marriage that had proven, decisively, to be anything but paper. Damiano's grip on the family's territory tightened rather than loosened, his reputation for ruthlessness undiminished. But something in him had softened enough that even his enemies began speaking of him differently. Not merely as a man to fear, but as a man who had, against every expectation, found something worth protecting. beyond mere obligation. Elena's father, too, found something like peace in it. "I worried when Matteo died," Antonio told her one evening, over the same worn velvet furniture of her childhood home, "that this family would swallow you whole, use you as a bridge, and then discard you the moment the bridge was no longer needed. I'm glad I was wrong." "You weren't entirely wrong," Elena admitted. "It could have gone that way. Damiano could have been his father's son instead of himself." But he wasn't. Antonio's smile was tired but genuine. "Matteo used to say Damiano fought his whole life not to become Aldo Castellano. I think, watching the two of you, he finally won that fight." It was on the anniversary of the funeral, 1 full year, almost to the day, since Elena had stood in that rain-soaked chapel and signed away the shape of her future, that Damiano took her back to the lake house from the old photograph, the two of them alone for the first time in months, no capos, no guards, beyond the 2 men Marco insisted on stationing discreetly at the property's edge. "I wanted you to have one good memory tied to this date," Damiano said, as they stood on the dock, overlooking water gone gold with late afternoon light, instead of only grief. "You remembered the date." "I remember everything about that year," he said quietly. "Every single detail. I could recite it back to you like scripture." She turned to face him, the lake breeze catching loose strands of her hair, and found him watching her with the same fierce, unguarded tenderness that had become as familiar to her now as his coldness had once been. "I love you," she said, the first time either of them had said the words aloud, though both had clearly known it for months, had lived inside the truth of it, even while circling the actual language. "I need you to know that. Whatever else is true, whatever grief still lives alongside it, I love you, Damiano. Not as a substitute, not as some quiet consolation prize. You, specifically, all of you, even the parts you've spent your whole life trying to hide." Something broke open in his expression. Relief so profound, it looked almost like pain. "Elena," he said, voice rough, and pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair for a long moment before he could speak again. "I have loved you since before I had any right to. I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond it, if love is the kind of thing that survives a person the way grief does. I don't have poetry for it. I only have the plain truth. You are the only thing in this entire, violent, calculating life of mine that I have never once had to strategize for. You're simply the answer. You always have been." They stood there a long while, the lake gone rose gold, the year's grief finally settling into something they could both carry without it crushing either of them, and neither of them noticed. In that golden, unguarded hour, the black sedan idling at the far tree line, watching, waiting, its occupant patient, in the particular way of a man who had spent an entire year learning exactly how to come back from the dead. 2 weeks after the anniversary, the first crack in their fragile peace appeared. Not as violence, not at first, but as something far stranger. A rumour, unconfirmed and impossible, threading its way through the lower ranks of the Marchetti household before it reached Damiano's ears at all. "A fisherman off the coast near Reggio Calabria," Marco reported, standing at attention in Damiano's study with the careful discomfort of a man delivering news he knew would land badly. "Swears he saw a man matching Matteo De Luca's description working the docks there." Says the man walked with a limp and had burn scarring down one side of his face, consistent with— Marco hesitated. Consistent with what the explosion would have done, if somehow he'd survived it. Elena, standing near the window, felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. "That's not possible," she said, though her voice shook with something that wasn't quite disbelief. "We identified his ring. The DNA on what remained was inconclusive," Damiano said quietly, and something in his voice made her turn to look at him fully. He'd gone very still. The particular stillness she'd learned meant he was working through something too large to process all at once. The fire was hot enough that formal identification relied largely on circumstantial evidence, personal effects, witness accounts of who was in the building. "We never had a body, Elena. We never actually had a body." "You never told me that." "Because it changed nothing at the time," Damiano said, and she heard beneath the careful control real anguish. Because grieving an inconclusive identification felt crueler than grieving a certainty. And because I didn't think, God help me, I never let myself think there was any real possibility he'd survived, buried somewhere for a year without a single word to either of us. "Why would he do that?" Elena's voice cracked. "If he survived, if it's really him, why would he let us believe he was dead for an entire year? Why would he let me marry his best friend and grieve him and slowly, so slowly fall in love again, if he was alive this whole time and simply chose to stay silent?" No one in the room had an answer. Marco shifted uncomfortably, clearly wishing himself anywhere else, and Damiano crossed the study to stand before her, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that did nothing to steady the tremor building beneath her ribs. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I intend to find out. I'm sending men to Reggio Calabria tonight. If it's a false lead, we'll know within days, and none of this needs to touch you at all. And if it's not—" He stopped, jaw working. "If it's not, then we deal with whatever that means, together. I promise you that." "Together," Elena echoed, though the word felt suddenly fragile, suddenly loaded with a weight she hadn't anticipated having to carry. The possibility, however remote, that the life she and Damiano had built across this last year might have been constructed atop a lie neither of them had chosen to tell, but a lie regardless. A debt of grief they might soon discover they'd never actually been owed. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She found herself standing at the terrace railing long after midnight, staring out at the harbour lights, turning the impossible rumour over and over until it wore grooves into her thoughts. She loved Damiano. That much had become unshakable truth over the past year, forged in fire and slow, careful trust. But she had loved Matteo first, had loved him completely, unreservedly, in the uncomplicated way one loves at 17 and 22, before grief and danger and Damiano's fierce, unguarded devotion had taught her love could also be complicated, could also require rebuilding from wreckage. If Matteo was alive, if he walked back into her life tomorrow, scarred and changed and impossibly, cruelly alive after a year of believing otherwise, she did not know, standing there in the dark, which version of her own heart she would even recognize as true. Behind her, she heard Damiano's footsteps approach, felt his arms come around her from behind, his chin resting against the top of her head, in the particular way that had become, over the last year, its own quiet language between them. "Whatever happens," he murmured against her hair, "I need you to know that I am not going anywhere. Not because Matteo made me promise to protect you, because I choose you. I have always chosen you, from the very first moment I let myself admit it. That doesn't change, no matter what we find out tomorrow." Elena turned in his arms, pressing her face against his chest, listening to the steady, grounding rhythm of his heart. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Not of him, of what it means about everything we've built, if he's really out there." "I know," Damiano said quietly. "I'm scared too. But we'll face it together, whatever it turns out to be." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his arms tightening around her, as though he could hold the coming storm at bay through sheer will alone. "I promise you that much, at least." Neither of them slept that night, and 3 days later the men Damiano sent to Reggio Calabria returned with a photograph that made the floor of Elena's entire world tilt permanently off its axis. The image was grainy, taken from a distance with a long lens, the kind of photograph meant to confirm a suspicion rather than announce it. But there was no mistaking the man in it, despite the changes a year of hiding and healing had wrought on his face. The burn scarring traced down the left side of his jaw exactly as the fisherman had described. The limp was visible, even in a single frozen frame. Weight shifted subtly away from his right leg. And the eyes. The same warm brown eyes that had looked at Elena across 1,000 family dinners, that had promised her forever the week before an explosion had supposedly ended his life, stared out from the photograph with an expression she couldn't read at this distance, but that looked, unmistakably, like a man watching something he had deliberately chosen to stay away from. "It's him," Elena whispered, her hand pressed against her mouth, the photograph trembling in her other hand. "Damiano, it's really him." Damiano's face had gone the particular white of a man holding himself together through pure will. His jaw locked so tight she could see the muscle jumping beneath his skin. "Matteo," he said, the name coming out strangled, disbelieving, a year of grief and guilt and complicated relief, all crashing together at once. "He's alive. He's actually—" He stopped, pressed the heel of his hand against his eyes for a long moment, and when he lowered it, something had hardened in his expression, something Elena recognized from the days immediately following the funeral, when grief had curdled into cold, controlled fury. "Why?" he said, very quietly. "Would he let us believe he was dead for an entire year?" "Marco," Elena said, turning to the soldier who'd brought the photograph, "did your men make contact? Did they speak to him?" "They tried, Signora. He disappeared before they could approach, vanished into the port district within hours of the photograph being taken. Whoever he's become in the last year, he's good at not being found, better than any of us expected." "Which means he's had help," Damiano said grimly. "Someone's been hiding him. Someone with resources, connections, the kind of protection that keeps a man off every family's radar for 12 months straight." His eyes met Eleanor's, and she saw beneath the fury something that looked almost like fear. Someone who wanted him to stay dead. Which means whatever happened in that warehouse a year ago wasn't the accident we were told it was. The realization landed like ice water. "You think someone faked his death deliberately?" Elena said slowly. "Not just that he survived by chance, that someone arranged for the world to believe he'd died. "I think," Damiano said, "that we need to find him before we do anything else, before we assume anything about his intentions, or the year he's spent hiding, or what he does or doesn't know about the two of us." He reached for her hand, his grip firm, grounding. "Elena, whatever we discover in the coming days, I need you to hear me clearly. Nothing about how I feel for you has changed. Nothing will change it. But I owe Matteo answers, the same way I owe you the truth, and I intend to get both, whatever it costs." It took 4 more days to locate him, 4 days of Damiano's men combing the port district of Reggio Calabria with a thoroughness bordering on obsession. 4 days in which Elena barely slept, caught between grief reopened and love hard-won, unable to reconcile the two without feeling as though she were betraying one or the other with every breath. When they finally found him, it was not in a dockside hideout or a rented room above some anonymous taverna, but in a modest villa in the hills above the town, guarded by 2 men Damiano's people didn't recognize. Men whose bearing, whose careful, professional wariness marked them immediately as something other than simple hired muscle. Damiano flew to Reggio Calabria himself, refusing to send anyone in his place, and Elena, after an argument that lasted the better part of an hour, an argument she ultimately won through sheer, immovable insistence, flew with him. "If he's alive," she told Damiano, on the plane, her hand gripping his so tightly her knuckles had gone white, "I need to hear whatever he has to say directly from him. I owe him that much. I owe myself that much." Damiano studied her for a long moment, something complicated moving behind his eyes. Love, fear, the particular jealousy of a man who had spent a year building something precious atop what he'd believed was solid ground, only to discover the earth might shift beneath him after all. "Okay," he said finally, quiet. "We do this together. Whatever it costs either of us." The villa came into view as their car wound up through the hills above the coastline, gold and stone against a backdrop of cypress trees, deceptively peaceful for a place that held, behind its walls, the answer to a year of grief neither of them had actually needed to carry. Matteo De Luca opened the villa's heavy wooden door himself, and for a long, suspended moment, none of the 3 of them said anything at all. He looked older than his 28 years should have allowed, the burns scarring along his jaw pale and rope-like, where the fisherman's description had failed to capture its full severity. His once easy posture now carrying the careful wariness of a man who had spent a year learning to expect danger from every direction. But his eyes, when they finally settled on Elena, held the same warmth she remembered from 1,000 ordinary days before the explosion, and beneath the warmth, something that looked unmistakably like guilt so profound it had aged him more than the fire itself. "Elena," he said, voice breaking on her name. "God, Elena, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant—" "You let us believe you were dead," she said, and the words came out sharper than she intended, a year of grief finally finding somewhere to land. "For an entire year, Matteo. My father aged a decade. I nearly lost my mind. We buried an empty casket, and I stood in the rain and I thought you were gone. And this whole time you were alive?" Matteo's face crumpled. "I didn't have a choice," he said. "Not at first." "Elena, please, let me explain. And then hate me if you still need to, but let me explain first. He led them into the villa's shaded sitting room, and there, over the following hour, the truth finally unspooled. A truth far darker than either Damiano or Elena had anticipated. The explosion, Matteo explained, had not been an accident, nor a Bratva strike, as everyone had assumed. It had been orchestrated by a faction within the Marchetti family itself, a splinter group led by Elena's own uncle, Vittorio Marchetti, who had grown convinced that Matteo's marriage to Elena would cement Castellano control over Marchetti territory permanently, stripping Vittorio and his allies of any future claim to power within the family. The bomb had been meant to kill Matteo outright. It had nearly succeeded. He'd survived only because he'd stepped out of the main structure moments before detonation to take a phone call, thrown clear by the blast's outer edge rather than caught in its heart, though the fire that followed had still very nearly finished the job the explosion started. Vittorio's men found me in the wreckage before your people did, Matteo said, hands trembling slightly around the glass of water he hadn't touched. They meant to finish what the bomb started, but one of them, a man named Enzo, an old friend of my mother's, God rest her, recognized me and couldn't bring himself to do it. He got me out, hid me, told Vittorio I'd died in the fire, same as everyone else believed. His throat worked. I was in a coma for 6 weeks. When I woke, Enzo told me the truth, that if I resurfaced too soon, before I understood exactly how deep Vittorio's conspiracy ran, he'd simply try again, and next time he wouldn't fail. He told me the only way to protect you, Eleanor, and protect Damiano was to stay dead until I could identify every single person involved and dismantle the conspiracy from the shadows. You could have told me, Damiano said, low, dangerous, the fury he'd been banking since the photograph finally surfacing in his voice. You could have told me, Matteo. I would have burned Vittorio's entire faction to the ground in a week if you'd simply reached out. That's exactly why I couldn't tell you, Matteo said, meeting his best friend's eyes with something like desperate honesty. Because I know you, Damiano. I know exactly what you would have done, and it would have started a war within the Marchetti family that could have gotten Elena killed in the crossfire before Vittorio's people were fully identified. I needed time. I needed to be patient in a way I knew you'd never allow yourself to be, not where she was concerned. His gaze shifted to Elena, aching, apologetic. I never imagined you'd marry Damiano. I thought, God, this sounds insane now, saying it aloud. I thought you'd simply wait, grieve and heal eventually, and I'd come back within a few months once I'd dismantled enough of the conspiracy to make it safe. I never anticipated the danger closing in on you so fast that marriage became your only real protection. I never anticipated a year, and I certainly never anticipated, his voice cracked, that you'd fall in love with him in the meantime. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Elena had ever heard. How long have you known? Damiano asked, very quietly, the kind of quiet that Elena had learnt over the past year to fear more than shouting. That we married, that we... He stopped, jaw working, unable to finish the sentence in front of the man whose memory had shaped both their choices for the entire year prior. 6 months, Matteo admitted, and had the grace at least to look ashamed of it. Enzo has contacts inside the family. I heard about the marriage almost as soon as it happened, but by then I understood exactly how necessary it had been. I'm not a fool, Damiano. I know what would have happened to her without your protection. I told myself it was fine, that it was exactly what I'd have wanted if I'd been able to ask for anything from that fire. But then the reports started coming in about how things had changed between the two of you, that it wasn't only protection anymore. His eyes, wet now, moved between them. I told myself I'd stay hidden until Vittorio's conspiracy was fully dismantled, no matter what I heard, because coming back too soon could still get you both killed. But watching that photograph get taken last week, knowing you'd finally found me, I realized I couldn't hide from this conversation any longer, however much it terrifies me. Elena's hands had gone cold in her lap. A year of grief, rebuilt slowly, painfully, into something she genuinely believed she'd earned the right to keep. And now the man she'd grieved sat across from her, alive, scarred, entirely real, watching her with an expression that held no anger, only a terrible, resigned grief of his own. "I don't know what to say to you," she admitted, voice shaking. "I loved you, Matteo. I loved you completely. I would have waited for you if I'd had any idea, any hope at all that you were alive. But I didn't. I buried you. I grieved you with my whole chest, and then, slowly, unwillingly at first, I fell in love with the man who held that grief alongside me every single day for a year. I don't know how to undo that, even now, even looking at you, even feeling everything I still feel for you rising up all at once." "I'm not asking you to undo it," Matteo said, and something in his voice, steadier now, more like the man she remembered from before the fire, suggested he'd had a year to arrive at this particular peace, even if she and Damiano had only just been handed the wreckage of it. "Elena, I have spent a year in hiding, healing from burns that nearly killed me, tracking down every single person involved in trying to murder me, and in all that time, the one thing that kept me from losing my mind entirely was knowing you were safe. Not with me, safe. If that safety came in the shape of Damiano's love instead of mine, then—" His voice broke just slightly before he steadied it again. "Then I'd rather have that than have you dead in some conspiracy I couldn't have prevented from a hospital bed in Calabria." "Matteo," Damiano started, but Matteo held up a hand, silencing him with the same easy authority he'd always carried, even now, even scarred and changed by everything the year had cost him. "I'm not finished," he said. "Damiano, you are my brother in every way that matters more than blood. I watched you fall in love with her before either of us had any right to name it, years ago at that lake house, and I chose not to see it, because I loved you both too much to let it complicate anything. I don't regret that choice, and I don't begrudge you what's grown between you this past year, however strange it feels to say that out loud while I'm still sitting here, alive, wanting things I no longer have any claim to." He exhaled, unsteady, and reached for Elena's hand across the table, and she let him take it, feeling the old, familiar warmth of his grip, alongside the new grief of understanding exactly what she was choosing to release. "I loved you, Elena. I will always love you. But I think the man sitting beside you has loved you for even longer than I did, in his own quiet, complicated way. And I think, somewhere in that Reggio Calabria hospital bed, some part of me already knew that if I ever came back, I wouldn't be coming back to reclaim what I'd lost. I'd be coming back to finally let it go. Elena wept then, finally, fully. A year of grief and love and impossible complication breaking loose all at once. Not only for what she'd lost in that fire, but for what Matteo was choosing, with a grace she hadn't expected, to release her from carrying any longer. And beside her, Damiano reached for her other hand, holding both her and his best friend's grief in the same steady grip. The three of them bound together by a year of devastation that had, against every possible expectation, finally arrived at something like peace. Peace, however, was not the same as safety. Vittorio Marchetti's conspiracy remained undismantled, and the moment word reached him that his nephew had resurfaced, even in the guarded shadows of a hillside villa in Calabria, Eleanor's life and Matteo's would once again be squarely in the crosshairs. "We move on, Vittorio, immediately," Damiano said, once the raw wreckage of the afternoon's revelations had settled into something they could all function around. His voice had regained its familiar, cold precision, the calculating boss reasserting himself now that the personal reckoning had been survived. "Matteo, I need everything you have, every name, every contact, every piece of evidence Enzo helped you gather this past year. We end this tonight, or as close to tonight as logistics allow." "There's a ledger," Matteo said, already moving toward a locked cabinet at the villa's far wall, pulling free a heavy leather-bound book that looked, even from across the room, like it contained enough documented sin to end several careers permanently. Vittorio's been skimming from the family's shipping operations for 3 years, funneling the difference to a private account he's been using to buy loyalty among the younger capos, the ones who resent how thin the Marchetti territory has grown under your father's stewardship, Eleanor. He's been building a shadow army inside your own family for years, waiting for the right moment to seize control. My marriage to you was supposed to cement Castellano protection over that territory permanently. Killing me was meant to remove the one obstacle standing between him and outright civil war within the family. Damiano took the ledger, flipping through pages of meticulous, damning detail with the focused intensity of a man who had spent his entire life reading exactly this kind of document. "This is enough to end him," he said grimly. "More than enough. We take this to the full Council of Families tomorrow night. Public exposure, formal tribunal. Vittorio doesn't get the mercy of a quiet death for this. He gets exposed as a traitor to every family watching, and he answers for it in front of all of them." "And if he doesn't wait for a tribunal?" Elena asked, cold dread pooling in her stomach. "If he finds out we know before we can move on him?" "Then he comes for us directly," Damiano said, "which is precisely why none of us are staying in Calabria a moment longer than necessary." He turned to Matteo. "You're coming back with us. Whatever complicated grief this reunion stirs up for all three of us, you're safer inside Castellano protection than anywhere else. And Vittorio's people will be looking for you the second word gets out that you're alive." Matteo hesitated, glancing at Elena, some old, careful deference passing between them, the shape of a question neither of them quite knew how to ask aloud. "Are you sure that's wise?" he asked. "Given everything?" "I'm sure it's necessary," Damiano said, with the particular flatness of a man setting aside personal complication in favour of tactical certainty. "Whatever this family becomes going forward, whatever shape the three of us settle into, none of it matters if Vittorio kills all of us first. We handle the threat. We figure out the rest afterward." They flew back that night, The three of them crowded into the same private jet that had carried Damiano and Elena to Calabria only hours before. The silence between them, thick, with everything still unresolved, but overlaid now with the shared, grim focus of people preparing for a fight. Elena watched the two men across the narrow cabin, Matteo, pale and scarred, exhausted from a year of hiding, finally catching up with him all at once. Damiano, sharp-eyed and coiled, already running through tactical scenarios behind his careful stillness, and felt, despite the exhaustion, despite the grief still raw beneath her ribs, a strange, fierce gratitude that both of them, against every possible expectation, were sitting in the same cabin, breathing the same air, alive. "Elena," Matteo said quietly, once Damiano had stepped away to take an urgent call from Marco. "For what it's worth, watching the two of you together this afternoon, even through everything, I could see it, what you have with him. It's not a substitute for what we had, it's something else entirely. Something that grew out of grief, but isn't made of grief anymore. I'm glad, even though it costs me something to say it. I'm glad you found that, even if I wasn't the one who gave it to you." "Matteo, don't," he said gently, echoing the same word Damiano had used months earlier under entirely different circumstances. "You don't owe me guilt on top of everything else this year has cost you. Just be happy, Elena. That's all I actually want, watching from wherever I land in your life now. I want you happy, whatever shape that takes." She reached across the narrow aisle and took his hand, holding it the way she might hold a brother's. The grief between them transformed, finally, gently, into something that no longer demanded anything of either of them except honesty. Below them, the coastline of Italy gave way to open water, dark and vast, carrying them back toward a reckoning neither Damiano nor Elena could yet fully anticipate. The full council of the 5 families convened 2 nights later, in a location so secretive, even Elena, married a full year into this world, had never been told its exact address, until the car pulled up outside a nondescript warehouse on the city's industrial waterfront, transformed inside into something almost cathedral-like. Vaulted ceilings, a long central table, the assembled heads of every major family in the region seated in careful, wary formation around it. Vittorio Marchetti arrived last, exactly as protocol demanded of a man summoned rather than invited, and Elena watched her uncle's face carefully as he took his seat, watched for the flicker of panic, the tell that would confirm everything Matteo had revealed in that Calabria villa. She found it almost immediately, a stiffness in his shoulders, a too careful neutrality in his expression that no innocent man would have needed to perform. Damiano stood to address the council, the ledger Matteo had recovered resting on the table before him like a loaded weapon. "I've called this gathering," he said, his voice carrying the particular authority that came from a decade of careful, ruthless leadership, "because a betrayal has come to light that concerns every family at this table. A year ago, we all believed Matteo De Luca died in an explosion meant to look like a Bratva strike." He paused, letting the weight of what came next settle fully into the room. Matteo did not die. He survived, and has spent the past year gathering evidence that the explosion was no accident at all, that it was orchestrated by a member of the Marchetti family, using stolen shipping funds to buy the loyalty of a shadow faction meant to seize control the moment the alliance between our 2 houses could be dismantled. The room erupted into murmurs, heads turning toward Vittorio, whose careful neutrality had begun, visibly, to crack. "This is absurd," Vittorio said, too quickly, too loudly. "De Luca is dead. Whatever theatrical claim you're making, Castellano, it's a fabrication meant to consolidate." The warehouse's side door opened, and Matteo De Luca walked in. The room fell utterly silent. Vittorio's face drained of all colour, the performance of outrage collapsing instantly into something far more telling. Raw, undisguised panic, the particular horror of a man watching his carefully constructed lie walk toward him in the flesh, scarred and very much alive. "Hello, Uncle," Matteo said, quiet, controlled, though Eleanor could see the tremor beneath his composure, the year of hiding and grief and fury finally arriving at its intended target. "I understand you thought I wouldn't be joining us tonight." What followed was, by Mafia standards, almost bureaucratically calm. The ledger passed hand to hand around the table, the assembled bosses reviewing the meticulous evidence of Vittorio's financial betrayal, his attempted murder of his own nephew, his 3-year campaign to destabilize an alliance that had kept relative peace between two major families. Elena watched her uncle's face crumble further with every page turned, every murmur of disgust that rippled around the table, until finally the eldest of the assembled bosses, a frail, ancient man named Constantine, who represented the oldest of the 5 families and carried by unspoken tradition the final word in matters of tribunal, set down the ledger and looked at Vittorio with an expression of terrible, absolute finality. "Vittorio Marchetti," Constantine said, his voice rasping but carrying easily across the silent room, "you have betrayed not merely your family, but the fundamental trust upon which every alliance at this table depends. You attempted to murder your own blood, to seize power through treachery rather than earn it through honour. This council does not tolerate such betrayal lightly." Vittorio's composure finally shattered entirely. "Please," he said, and Elena felt a sick twist of pity beneath her fury, watching the man who had orchestrated a year of devastating grief reduced, finally, to begging. "Please, whatever you decide, my children have no part in this. My wife. Your family's fate will be decided separately, and with more mercy than you extended to your nephew," Constantine said. "You will not be afforded that same courtesy." What happened to Vittorio Marchetti after the council rendered its judgment, Elena never fully learned, and did not ask to. Some things in this world she had come to understand across the past year were better left behind closed doors, absorbed into the ledger of consequences that kept the fragile peace between families intact. What mattered, walking out of that warehouse into the cold night air with Damiano's hand firm around hers and Matteo walking free and unburdened beside them for the first time in a year, was that the conspiracy that had shattered her life, remade it, and nearly shattered it again, had finally, decisively, ended. "It's over," Damiano said quietly, as they stood together outside the warehouse, the harbour wind cutting cold and clean after the warehouse's stifling tension. "Whatever comes next, that threat is gone. You're safe now, truly safe, not just protected." Elena looked between the two men who had, in entirely different ways, shaped the last 2 years of her life. One who had loved her first and released her with grace. One who had loved her in silence for years before circumstance finally gave him permission to speak it aloud, and felt, for the first time since the rain-soaked funeral that had started all of it, the full, unburdened weight of simply being alive and free and loved. The weeks following Vittorio's tribunal brought a strange, careful reconstruction to Eleanor's world. Not a return to how things had been before the explosion, because that world no longer existed and perhaps never could again, but the slow assembly of something new from its wreckage. Matteo remained in the city, though not at the Castellano penthouse. He took rooms instead at his mother's old house, empty since her death years earlier, and began, with the same careful patience he'd shown throughout his year in hiding, the process of reintegrating into a family and a world that had spent 12 months believing him dead. It was not easy. The scarring along his jaw drew stares at family gatherings he'd once moved through with easy confidence. The limp slowed him in ways that frustrated a man who had once prided himself on quick, decisive action. And the particular grief of watching Eleanor build a life with his best friend, however gracefully he'd released his claim to it, cost him more, privately, than he ever let show in front of either of them. "Do you ever regret it?" Eleanor asked him one afternoon, the two of them sharing coffee on the small terrace of his mother's old house, a friendship rebuilding itself slowly into something new and unnamed. Not what they'd once had, not quite what family became either, but something honest, something that had survived fire and grief and come out the other side, changed, but real. "Releasing me the way you did? You could have fought for it. Some men would have." "Every day," Matteo admitted, with the same disarming honesty that had first drawn her to him at 17. "But regret isn't the same as wishing I'd chosen differently. I watched you with Damiano in that villa, Elena. I saw what a year of shared grief and slow, careful trust had built between the two of you. Fighting for what we'd had would have meant asking you to choose between two different kinds of love, and I don't think either version would have survived that choice intact. Better to release it whole than to shatter it, fighting over the pieces. That's a generous way to look at it. I've had a year in a hospital bed and a hillside villa to arrive at generosity," Matteo said, with a small, wry smile that held, finally, more peace than pain. "Grief teaches you things given enough time. Mostly, it taught me that love doesn't always look like keeping. Sometimes it looks like letting go well." Damiano, for his part, had extended an olive branch to his best friend, with the same careful precision he brought to every important negotiation of his life, offering Matteo a position within the Castellano family's territory, not out of guilt, he was careful to clarify, but out of genuine respect for a man who had survived a year of devastating betrayal with more grace than most men could manage in a lifetime. "I'm not offering you this because I feel indebted to you," Damiano told him, the two of them sharing a rare, quiet drink on the terrace one evening, Elena watching from the doorway with a warmth she hadn't expected to feel, watching these two men rebuild their brotherhood from such complicated wreckage. "I'm offering it because you're the best strategist I've ever known, and this family needs men like you now more than ever, with Vittorio's faction still requiring careful management even after the tribunal." "And if I say no?" Matteo asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer he wanted to give. "Then I'll respect that too," Damiano said. "But Matteo, you're my brother. That didn't stop being true because of anything that happened this past year, however complicated it's made things between the three of us. I'd rather have you close, rebuilding whatever this is supposed to become now, than lose you a second time to circumstances neither of us chose." Matteo accepted the position within the week, and slowly, carefully, the three of them began constructing something that had no easy name, Not quite family in the traditional sense, not quite friendship unmarked by complication, but something honest, forged in fire and grief, and the particular courage it took to choose peace over resentment, generosity over bitterness. It was Elena's father, watching the three of them together at a family dinner some weeks later, Matteo and Damiano deep in easy, familiar argument about territory logistics, Elena laughing at some old joke between them that had survived even the year's devastation intact, who finally voiced what all of them had been quietly circling for weeks. "You've built something rare," Antonio said to his daughter, quiet, watching the scene with the particular wonder of a man who had spent 30 years inside this violent world and rarely seen anything like genuine peace emerge from its wreckage. Most families would have torn themselves apart over less than what the three of you survived this past year. Instead, you built something new from it. That's no small thing, Elena. That's a kind of grace this family hasn't seen in generations. Elena watched Damiano across the table, catching his eye as he glanced up from his conversation with Matteo, and the warmth that passed between them, steady now, hard-won, entirely unshadowed by the guilt that had once made him retreat from every unguarded feeling, felt, finally, like the answer to a year of grief she'd never fully expected to survive intact. 6 months after Vittorio's tribunal, on a morning bright with early autumn light, Damiano found Elena in the penthouse library once more, surrounded by the same box of old photographs that had first cracked open everything between them nearly 2 years earlier. "I have something to ask you," he said, and something in his voice, a rare, unguarded nervousness she'd only ever seen from him a handful of times across their entire history together, made her set the photographs aside immediately. "That sounds serious." "It is." He came to kneel before her, and Elena's breath caught as she understood suddenly exactly what he intended. "Elena, the marriage we signed 2 years ago was a contract, paper and protection, exactly as I promised you it would be. And it kept you safe when nothing else could have. But it was never the marriage I actually wanted to give you. I want to ask you properly this time. Not out of necessity, not because the wolves are at the gate and paper is the only currency they respect. I want to marry you because I choose you, entirely, without any calculation attached to it at all. The first time in my life I've ever wanted something without immediately running the cost-benefit analysis first." He produced a ring, not the practical, unremarkable band they'd exchanged at the courthouse 2 years prior, but something clearly chosen with care, an heirloom sapphire that Elena recognized with a jolt from an old photograph of Damiano's mother, one of the few keepsakes of her that had survived his father's violent temper intact. "This was hers," Damiano said, following her gaze. "One of the only things of my mother's I still have. She died when I was 12, and I've kept this ring locked away for 20 years because I never trusted myself enough to give it to anyone. Never believed I had it in me to love someone the way she loved my father, before he became the man who broke her. But I trust it now. I trust this. I trust you completely, with the softest, least calculating part of myself I have left." His voice roughened. "Elena Marchetti, will you marry me? Not as a contract, not as protection, as a vow I actually intend to keep for the rest of whatever life we're lucky enough to build together." Elena, tears streaming freely down her face for the first time in longer than she could remember, reached for his hands, pulling him up to meet her properly. "Yes," she said, the word arriving without a single moment of hesitation, without the careful weighing of consequence that had once defined every choice either of them made in this violent, glittering world they both belonged to. Yes, Damiana, completely, entirely, without any conditions attached. Yes. The wedding that followed 3 months later bore no resemblance to the quiet courthouse ceremony that had bound them 2 years earlier. It took place at the lake house, the same golden dock where Damiano had first told her he loved her, surrounded not by the full weight of capos and rival families performing allegiance, but by the people who had actually earned a place in the wreckage and rebuilding of Elena's life. Her father, finally at peace, Consuela, who had watched the whole slow thaw unfold from the kitchen with the patient wisdom of a woman who'd seen everything. Isabella Greco, genuinely delighted rather than performing delight for once. And Matteo, standing beside Damiano as his best man, exactly as tradition and genuine brotherhood demanded, his scarred face split by a smile that held, finally, only joy. "I used to think," Matteo said during his toast, raising his glass to the assembled guests with the easy confidence that had slowly, over the past year, returned fully to him, "that the cruelest thing that could happen to a man was losing the woman he loved to his best friend. I know now I was wrong. The cruelest thing would have been losing both of them entirely, to grief, to bitterness, to a year of hiding that could have destroyed everything worth saving, instead of, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, building something even stronger from the wreckage." He raised his glass higher, eyes bright with unshed tears. "To Damiano and Elena, my brother, and the woman who taught both of us that love doesn't always look like keeping. Sometimes it looks like choosing each other, again and again, through every impossible circumstance life throws at you." Damiano pulled Elena close as the assembled guests raised their glasses, his forehead resting against hers, the golden lake light catching in her hair exactly as it had the evening he'd first told her he loved her. "No more contracts," he murmured, "just for her. Only this, only you, for the rest of my life, freely chosen, every single day." "Only this," Eleanor echoed, and kissed him, the weight of 2 years of grief and fire and impossible hard-won love finally settling into something that felt, at last, entirely and permanently like home. 3 years after that golden wedding at the lake house, Eleanor stood on the same dock at dusk, watching her daughter, barely 2 years old, dark-haired and fierce-eyed, in exactly the way her father was, though she'd inherited her mother's stubborn refusal to be told what she couldn't do, chase fireflies across the grass with the reckless joy of a child who had never once had to learn the careful calculations that had once governed every hour of her parents' lives. "She's going to be terrifying," Damiano observed, coming to stand beside her, his arm settling around her waist with the easy, unguarded affection that had become, over the years, as natural to him as breathing had once seemed impossible. "Salvatore's already terrified of her, and she's too. She gets that from you. She gets the stubbornness from you," Damiano corrected, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was never stubborn. I was strategic. You were terrifying," Elena said, laughing, "and secretly soft the entire time, which is somehow worse." Matteo had married, eventually, 2 years after Damiano and Elena's wedding, a quiet, unassuming woman named Julia, who ran a small restaurant near the harbour and had no interest whatsoever in the world of families and territory and careful, violent calculation that had once nearly cost Matteo his life. He'd found in her the kind of uncomplicated peace he'd spent a year in hiding, learning to want for himself. And watching him now, across the lake house lawn, laughing with his own young son perched on his shoulders, while Julia looked on with warm, unguarded affection, Elena felt the last lingering traces of old grief settle fully, finally, into simple gratitude. The Marchetti-Castellano alliance had held, stronger now than it had ever been under the fragile pretense that had first bound Elena to Damiano's protection, no longer built on paper and necessity, but on genuine trust, on a family that had survived betrayal and fire and impossible complication, and emerged, against every reasonable expectation, closer for having weathered it together. Vittorio's remaining faction had been fully dismantled within the first year following the tribunal. The shadow army he'd built dissolved and absorbed back into legitimate Marchetti and Castellano operations. The wound he'd inflicted finally fully healed. "Do you ever think about how differently this could have gone?" Elena asked, watching their daughter finally tire of the fireflies and toddle unsteadily toward Matteo's son. The two of them immediately, instinctively drawn together in the easy way children are, unburdened by any of the complicated history that had once made their parents' bond so fraught. "Every day," Damiano admitted. "I think about the 4 minutes it took me to reach your father's house during the attack. I think about how close Vittorio came to finishing what he started in that warehouse. I think about how easily I could have lost you before I ever let myself admit what you meant to me." His arm tightened around her waist. "But I don't dwell on it, not the way I used to. I've learned, these past few years, that dwelling on what could have gone wrong steals something from what actually went right. And what actually went right, Eleanor, is more than I ever let myself believe I deserved." "You deserved it," Eleanor said firmly, turning in his arms to face him fully, the golden dusk light catching the same sapphire ring he'd given her 3 years earlier. "You spent your whole life believing love was a weakness your father had beaten out of you before you were old enough to understand what you were losing. You were wrong. It was never weakness, Damiano. It just took the right person and the right amount of grief to teach you that." "It took you," he said simply, cupping her face in both hands with the same careful tenderness he'd shown her since that first devastating kiss in the library, nearly 4 years ago now. "It always would have taken you, Elena. I think some part of me knew that from the very first summer Matteo brought you to that lake house. Though it took losing him, however temporarily, to teach me I was allowed to want something for myself instead of simply protecting it for someone else's sake." Below them, their daughter's laughter carried across the water, bright and unafraid, the particular sound of a childhood built on love instead of calculation, on trust instead of the careful, violent arithmetic that had once governed every hour of her parents' lives. Matteo caught Elena's eye across the lawn and raised his glass slightly in her direction, a small, private acknowledgement of everything the three of them had survived together, transformed now into simple, unburdened gratitude. "No more contracts," Damiano murmured again, the same vow he'd made her 3 years earlier, renewed now in the golden light of everything they'd built since. Only this, only us, for the rest of our lives. Only this, Elena echoed, and kissed him as the sun finally sank below the lake's far tree line. The darkness that followed, no longer the danger it had once represented throughout their entire, violent, glittering world, but simply, peacefully, the quiet close of another, ordinary, extraordinary day in the life they had chosen, deliberately and completely, for each other.